The soft hum of a woman's voice drifted from behind my locked bathroom door, a sound so domestic and out of place it made my skin crawl. I'd lived alone with my daughter in this house for 3 years, and Serafina was spending the weekend with her grandmother 2 hours away. The house should have been silent, empty, mine. I stood frozen in the hallway, my architect's brain cataloging impossibilities. Every window locked, the alarm system armed until I disarmed it 60 seconds ago. No signs of forced entry. My hand found the baseball bat I kept in the hall closet, my grip tightening around the worn wood as I crept toward the master bathroom. Through the crack under the door, I could see steam curling into the hallway, and that humming continued, casual and eerily familiar, as if whoever was in there had every right to be. I should have called the police, should have gotten Serafina's bat and my phone, and backed out of the house. But something, instinct, stupidity, or the particular kind of protectiveness that comes from being a single father, made me grip that bat tighter and kick the door open instead. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel, and it proves that powerful stories resonate everywhere. I didn't call the police that first night with Angela in my house, even though I knew I should have. Something about her genuine confusion and the tears that came when I suggested she leave made me hesitate. She wasn't dangerous or threatening. She was simply a woman who had completely lost touch with reality, and turning her over to strangers felt cruel. Instead, I let her stay in my living room while I tried to understand what had happened. She continued insisting we were married, describing our wedding day and our life together with such conviction that it was disturbing. The details she knew about my house were accurate. She could describe where I kept things, what furniture I owned, but she'd woven these facts into an elaborate fiction where we'd chosen everything together as a couple. None of it had happened. I'd bought every item in this house alone, or with my daughter, over the past 3 years since my divorce. As the evening wore on, I watched her carefully. She wasn't drunk or on drugs. She seemed completely lucid except for this one massive delusion that she lived here as my wife. When I pressed her for details about how she'd arrived at my house that day, she couldn't answer. She just insisted she'd always been here, that this was her home. But I could see doubt beginning to creep into her eyes, a growing fear that something was terribly wrong with her mind. I made the decision to let her sleep on my couch that night. It was probably stupid, possibly dangerous, but she seemed so vulnerable that I couldn't bring myself to force her out into the night. After she fell asleep, I went back to the bathroom where I'd first found her and collected her clothes. In her expensive designer bag, I found no identification, no phone, no wallet. But at the bottom, tucked into the lining, was a hospital ID badge. Dr. Angela Thorne, neurosurgery, St. Catherine's Medical Center. A quick internet search told me everything I needed to know. Angela was a famous neurosurgeon, one of the best in her field, who had pioneered some groundbreaking surgical technique. She was 36, accomplished, respected, and she'd been reported missing 3 days earlier. She'd left her hospital after a long shift and simply vanished. Her fiancé had filed a missing person report. The police were looking for her. And somehow, she'd ended up 2 hours away in my bathroom, her mind fractured and confused. I should have called the police immediately. I should have called the hospital. But it was late, and she was sleeping, and I told myself I'd make the calls in the morning. The truth was, I was afraid of what would happen to her when I did. The next morning, I had to pick up my daughter from my mother's house. I explained to Serafina on the drive home that we had a guest, a woman who was sick and confused and needed our help for a little while. Serafina took the news with her usual seriousness. She'd learned to be cautious about unexpected changes after watching her parents' marriage fall apart. When we arrived home, Angela was awake and dressed in some old clothes I'd left out for her. I'd expected awkwardness or fear from my daughter, but instead, Serafina seemed to understand that Angela was someone who needed kindness. The two of them formed an unexpected bond quickly. Angela treated Serafina with genuine interest and warmth, and my daughter responded to it. They spent the afternoon talking, and I watched as Angela unconsciously revealed pieces of her real self. Medical knowledge she didn't realize she had. Details about hospitals and surgery that came out naturally in conversation. Over the next few days, I kept Angela at my house while trying to gently help her remember who she really was. I showed her the ID badge, the news articles about her disappearance, the information about her career. Each piece of evidence seemed to disturb her, creating cracks in the false reality she'd built. She would look at the photos of herself at medical conferences and claim they weren't her, but I could see recognition in her eyes, mixed with something like terror. Serafina helped in ways I couldn't. She asked Angela simple questions about medicine and science, and Angela would answer with expert knowledge, then look confused about how she knew such things. My daughter had a gentleness with her that I lacked, a way of making Angela feel safe enough to start questioning her own memories. I learned that Angela had been living an impossibly demanding life before she disappeared. The articles describe her schedule: 80-hour work weeks, high-stakes surgeries, constant pressure to publish research and speak at conferences. Her fiancé was a prominent businessman who appeared in some of the photos with her, always looking polished and detached. The hospital administrator spoke about her like she was a valuable asset rather than a person. During this time, my own carefully ordered life began to shift. For 3 years since my divorce, I'd lived according to strict routines, color-coded schedules, meal prep Sundays, emotional distance from anything that might hurt me. I'd built a safe, predictable existence for myself and Serafina. But Angela's presence disrupted everything. She was spontaneous and emotional in ways that made me uncomfortable. She laughed at things I didn't find funny. She cried easily. She wanted to talk about feelings and memories and dreams. And somehow, slowly, her openness started to crack the walls I'd built around myself. Everything changed when my ex-wife showed up unannounced on the 4th day. Beatrix had heard from a neighbor that there was a strange woman living in my house, and she arrived furious and ready for confrontation. She stood in my doorway and immediately started threatening me with a custody battle, accusing me of being unstable and reckless for harboring what she called a mental patient around our daughter. The argument was brutal. Beatrix had always been good at finding my weak points, and she hit every one of them. She said I was being selfish and irresponsible, that I was putting Serafina in danger, that any judge would see the situation as evidence of my poor judgment. She demanded that I either call the police immediately or she would do it herself and use this entire incident in court to get full custody of our daughter. Angela heard everything. She'd been in the guest room when Beatrix arrived, but the shouting brought her out, and she stood at the top of the stairs listening to my ex-wife describe her as a dangerous stranger who didn't belong in a house with a child. I watched Angela's face crumble, watched her start to believe that maybe she really was a problem everyone said she was. Beatrix left after making her threats clear, and I had 24 hours to fix the situation before she took action. The house felt poison after she left. All the quiet progress we'd made with Angela suddenly undermined by my ex-wife's harsh words. But worse was yet to come. That same evening, 2 people from Angela's real life arrived at my door. The first was Dr. Marcus Webb, the chief administrator of St. Catherine's Medical Center. The second was Richard Calloway, Angela's fiancé. They'd somehow tracked her location, probably through financial records or surveillance I didn't understand, and they'd come to take her back. The way they talked about Angela made me sick. Dr. Webb kept referring to her breakdown and discussing her treatment plan like she was a malfunctioning piece of equipment that needed repair. He talked about the surgeries that had been canceled, the patients who had been reassigned, the inconvenience her disappearance had caused the hospital. He never once asked how Angela was feeling or what had driven her to run away. Richard was worse in a different way. He was handsome and well-dressed and said all the right concerned words, but everything about him felt calculated and cold. He talked about Angela like she was an embarrassing problem he needed to manage. He kept mentioning their upcoming wedding, the guests who had been invited, the venue that had been booked. He mentioned how her episode was going to look to his business partners and her colleagues. Not once did he actually look at Angela with anything resembling love or genuine concern. I watched Angela shrink under their attention. The woman who had been slowly coming back to herself over the past few days seemed to fold inward, becoming small and quiet. They treated her like she had no right to make decisions about her own life, like her only option was to come back with them and resume the existence she fled from. Something in me snapped. Maybe it was seeing how they talked to her, or maybe it was the way Angela looked at me with such desperate hope that I would protect her. I told them to leave. I said Angela wasn't going anywhere until she was ready, that she needed time and space to heal, not to be dragged back into the life that had broken her. Dr. Webb threatened legal action. Richard made it clear that I was interfering in their lives and would regret it. But I stood my ground, and eventually they left, promising they'd be back with lawyers and police if necessary. After they left, Angela collapsed. Not physically, but emotionally. She sat on the floor of my living room and told me fragments of memories that were starting to return. She remembered the exhaustion, the pressure, the feeling of being trapped in a life that was crushing her. She remembered standing in a hospital corridor after a 72-hour shift and feeling like she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't continue. She remembered getting in her car and driving with no destination in mind, just trying to escape. She didn't remember how she'd ended up at my house specifically, but she'd seen an article about my landscape architecture work months earlier, something about sustainable residential design, and my house had stuck in her mind as representing everything her life wasn't. It was warm and lived in and real, unlike her sterile apartment and demanding career. Somehow, in her fractured state, she'd driven here in her mind to create a fantasy where this was her home, where she belonged to this peaceful life instead of the one that was destroying her. Listen, if you're still here, it means you're invested. You want to see what happens next. But here's the reality. Most people watch stories like this and scroll away without subscribing. They enjoy it, then vanish. If this story actually matters to you, if you genuinely care about how it ends, hit that subscribe button. It only takes a second. Otherwise, you'll probably forget this channel exists and miss all the other incredible stories I share. The next few days were tense. Beatrix was calling constantly, demanding updates and threatening legal action. Dr. Webb and Richard had contacted lawyers, and I've received official letters about unlawfully harboring Angela and interfering with medical care. I'd hired a lawyer of my own, though I had no idea how I was going to pay for it. Everything was spiraling in directions I couldn't control. But Angela was changing. The confrontation with her old life had shaken something loose in her memory. More and more fragments were returning. Not the false memories of our marriage, but real memories of who she actually was. She remembered her medical training, her first surgery, the moment she'd realized she had a gift for neurosurgery. She remembered her parents, both dead now, who had pushed her toward excellence from childhood. She remembered meeting Richard at a hospital fundraiser and how their relationship had been more of a merger than a romance. Two successful people combining their lives because it looked good on paper. She remembered the pressure building over years. The expectation that she would work longer hours, take on more complex cases, publish more research, speak at more conferences. She remembered canceling vacations, missing weddings and funerals, eating meals standing up between surgeries. She remembered Richard's impatience with her exhaustion, his suggestions that she was being emotional when she talked about feeling overwhelmed. She remembered the hospital administrators praising her dedication while piling on more responsibilities. And she remembered the breaking point, a surgery that had gone wrong despite her best efforts, a patient who had died on her table, and the expectation that she would simply move on to the next case without time to process the loss. She remembered driving away from the hospital in a daze, feeling like she was disappearing even while she was still physically present. Watching her remember was painful. Each recovered memory seemed to hurt her, and there were moments when I could see her wanting to retreat back into the comfortable delusion where she was my wife and this was her home. But Serafina kept her grounded. My daughter had a way of asking simple, honest questions that helped Angela face the truth without judgment. During this time, something unexpected happened to me. Helping Angela find herself made me realize how lost I'd been in my own life. For 3 years, I'd been going through the motions, working, parenting, maintaining my house and routines, but I hadn't really been living. I'd built such careful walls around my heart after my divorce that I'd stopped feeling much of anything. I convinced myself that safety and predictability were enough, that protecting myself from pain was the same as being happy. Angela's vulnerability, her struggle to reclaim her identity, forced me to confront my own emotional numbness. I'd been sleepwalking through my life just as much as she'd been running from hers. We'd both been hiding, just in different ways. One evening, While Serafina was at a friend's house, Angela and I sat in my backyard and had the most honest conversation of my life. She told me she remembered everything now. Her real life, her career, her fiancé, and also the false memories of our marriage that her broken mind had created. She said the made-up memories felt more real than her actual life had, that the fantasy of being my wife had given her something her real life never had. Peace, safety, the feeling of being valued for who she was rather than what she could produce. I told her things I'd never said out loud, that my marriage had ended because I'd stopped fighting for it, that I'd let Beatrix leave without really trying to save what we had, because part of me was relieved to have an excuse to stop trying, that I'd spent 3 years building a life that looked stable but felt empty, that helping her had woken something up in me that I thought was dead, the capacity to care about someone, to fight for someone, to risk getting hurt again. We sat in the growing darkness of my backyard, two broken people who had accidentally found each other, and for the first time in years, I felt fully awake. Angela made her decision on a Tuesday morning. She called Dr. Webb and formally resigned from St. Catherine's Medical Center. She called Richard and ended their engagement. She told them both that she wasn't coming back, that the life she'd been living had nearly destroyed her, and she needed to build something different. The phone calls were brutal. Dr. Webb tried guilt and intimidation, reminding her of her obligations and responsibilities. Richard was angry in a cold, controlled way, accusing her of humiliating him and destroying their plans. But Angela held firm. She told them she was grateful for the opportunities they'd given her, but that she couldn't continue sacrificing her health and sanity for their expectations. There were legal complications, of course. She had contracts and agreements that needed to be resolved. But with help from my lawyer and her own determination, she managed to extricate herself from most of her obligations. She lost money in the process and burned bridges in her professional world. But she didn't seem to care. For the first time in her adult life, she was making choices based on what she needed rather than what others expected from her. Beatrix tried to use the situation against me in court, but it backfired. When the judge heard the full story, that I'd helped a woman in medical crisis, that I protected her from being forced back into a harmful situation, that my daughter had been safe and cared for throughout, it actually reflected well on my character. Beatrix's threats of a custody battle evaporated, though our relationship remained tense. Angela didn't stay with me permanently during those transitional months. She found a small apartment nearby and started rebuilding her life step by step. She took a teaching position at a small medical school, sharing her knowledge with students without the crushing pressure of performing surgeries. She started therapy to process the burnout and breakdown she'd experienced. She learned to live at a sustainable pace, with regular sleep and meals and time for herself. But she was part of our lives. She came for dinner twice a week. She helped Serafina with science homework. She and I would take long walks through the parks I designed, talking about everything and nothing. We didn't rush into romance. We were both too damaged and cautious of that. But something was growing between us, something real and solid that we were both afraid to name. 6 months after I'd found her in my bathroom, we had a small celebration. Angela had successfully completed her first semester teaching and felt proud of the work she was doing. Serafina had aced her science final, partly thanks to Angela's tutoring. And I had finally done something I'd been avoiding for 3 years. I cleaned out the boxes in my garage, the ones full of items from my marriage that I'd been too afraid to look at or throw away. It was a small thing, but it symbolized something important. I was finally letting go of the past and making space for the future. We spent that Saturday in my backyard, the three of us planting a garden. Angela wore old jeans and one of my t-shirts, her hands dirty and her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked nothing like the polished surgeon in those conference photos, and everything like someone who had found her way home. Serafina ran around gathering supplies, talking constantly about what vegetables we should plant and whether we grow strawberries. I watched them together and realized that the stranger who had appeared in my bathroom 6 months ago had become essential to my life, not because I'd saved her, but because in the process of helping her find herself, I'd found myself too. We'd both been lost in different ways, and somehow we'd stumbled into each other's lives at exactly the right moment. Later that evening, after Serafina had gone to bed, Angela came back downstairs and found me on the back porch. She sat next to me in the comfortable silence we developed, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. She told me she'd been in the bathroom that morning, the master bathroom where I'd first found her, and she caught her reflection in the mirror. For the first time in years, maybe in her entire adult life, she'd looked at herself and recognized a woman staring back. Not the surgeon, not the overachiever, not someone else's daughter or fiancé or colleague. Just herself, whole and real and enough. I understood what she meant. I'd had a similar moment a few weeks earlier, sitting at my kitchen table with Serafina, laughing about something silly, and realizing that I felt happy. Not just content or stable or safe, but actually happy. The careful walls I'd built around my heart had crumbled without me noticing, and instead of feeling vulnerable, I felt alive. We didn't have all the answers. Angela was still healing from her breakdown, and figuring out who she wanted to be outside the identity she'd built her whole life. I was still learning how to open my heart again, without being paralyzed by the fear of getting hurt. We were taking things slowly, carefully, with no promises or pressure. But we had time, and we had each other. And somehow that was enough. The garden we planted that day would take months to grow, requiring patience and care and consistent attention. It seemed like the right metaphor for what we were building. Not a fantasy that appeared overnight and felt perfect immediately, but something real that would take time and work, and would be all the more valuable because of it. Angela looked at me in the darkness of the porch and smiled. That same genuine smile I'd seen in my bathroom 6 months ago, when she looked at me with confused affection and called me honey. Except now, the confusion was gone. She knew exactly who I was, and who she was. And she was choosing to be here anyway, and I was choosing the same thing. Not because I had to, not because she needed rescuing, or because I was lonely, but because somewhere in the chaos of her breakdown and my carefully controlled life, we found something neither of us had expected. A second chance. The stranger in my mirror had become the person I wanted to see every day. And I'd become someone I actually recognize again. Someone who was willing to take risks, to feel things deeply, to live instead of just surviving. It wasn't a life either of us had planned, but it was real, and it was ours, and that made it perfect. This story teaches us that sometimes the people who seem the most put together are actually falling apart inside, and that healing often requires the courage to step away from what looks successful to others in order to find what's actually healthy for ourselves. Angela's breakdown wasn't weakness. It was her mind's desperate attempt to save her from a life that was destroying her, while John's rigid routines were his way of avoiding the pain of truly living. Both of them learned that real strength isn't about maintaining perfect control or meeting everyone else's expectations. It's about being honest with yourself, asking for help when you need it, and having the courage to rebuild your life even when it means disappointing others. The lesson is clear. Burnout and emotional numbness are warnings we ignore at our own peril, and sometimes the greatest act of self-love is simply giving yourself permission to stop, breathe, and choose a different path, even if that path looks nothing like what you planned. So here's the real question. Did you subscribe yet? Thousands of people will listen to this story and won't subscribe. Please don't be that person. Kindly support what I do here by subscribing. And then drop in the comment section if you like part 2 of John, Angela, and Serafina's story. What challenges will they face as they build their new life together? How will Angela navigate her return to medicine on her own terms? Will Richard or the hospital try to interfere? Let me know if you want to hear more.